Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Hollywood Historical Women in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Hollywood Historical Women in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about legendary jazz musician, the late Billie Holiday. All images used in this video are under fair use of United States copyright law of 1976. Now, your Billie Holiday was a legendary jazz singer who is known for her signature song, Strange Fruit, which makes a powerful commentary about lynching in America. And your Billie Holiday, sadly, was on the road to becoming a woman in crisis before she had her successful career because she was born in a dysfunctional home where she never got any sort of support from either of her parents. Now, your Billie Holiday started out life born Eleanor Fagan on April of 1915 to a teenage mother and father, your Sarah Julia Fagan and your Clarence Holiday. And neither parent was prepared to go out here and raise a child to become a healthy girl. No, because your Eleanor Fagan had no support from her parents. She made arrangements for her older married half-sister, Eva Miller, to go out here and raise Eleanor in Baltimore. So the mother basically handed the child off to her older married half-sister, and your Clarence Halliday basically abandoned the family to go out here and become a jazz banjo player and guitarist. And this is the report that some people have as related to Billie Holiday's paternity. However, a birth certificate in Baltimore lists her father as Frank D. Vies, and it's hard to say who is Billie Holiday's father, but this is the foundation of dysfunction that led to your Billie Holiday basically starting out on the road to becoming a woman in crisis. Now, as your Eleanor Fagan was growing up in Baltimore and living with her half-sister, and her mother was out here working on transportation jobs, serving on the passenger railroads, and as she was working there in those passenger railroads, the mother-in-law was out here raising your Billie Holiday or Eleanor Fagan, and because she never got nurtured or got her emotional needs met, this led to your Billie Holiday becoming an extremely insecure child because she was not able to get her emotional needs met. And because she wasn't able to get her emotional needs met, she really did not have that stability in the beginning of her life to be able to function healthy. Now, because she had nobody there to give her structure and order, when she started attending kindergarten at the St. Francis Academy, the 5-year-old Eleanor Fagan began skipping school, and this truancy wound up with her being brought before the juvenile court in 1925 when she was 9 years old. Now, I believe the reason why your Eleanor Fagan, also known as Billie Holiday, was skipping school is because she had no real structure as related to her family unit. She had no real stability, and because she didn't have anybody to go out here and trust as related to her home life, she went out here looking to go out here and wander away from school because she had not been taught how to submit to either male or female authority figures. She had no real family structure, and she had no real sense of order. And as a result of her having no real family structure or family order, this is why she was skipping school, because in order to go to school, you need to have a stable family unit, you need to have stable family structure, you have to have your emotional needs met to make you emotionally secure. But sadly, your Eleanor Fagan, also known as Billie Holiday, did not have any of this stability, so she really was chafing at the authority in these schools, and this is why she was truant all the time. Now, this is why they wound up taking her away and putting her in the juvenile court, and she went to the House of the Good Shepherd, a Catholic reform school, where she was baptized in 1925. But sadly, as she was baptized in 1925, she went back into a hellish life. Even though her mother had opened up a restaurant called the East Side Grill, she wound up in a miserable situation because she and her mother were working long hours at this restaurant, and your Billie Holiday wound up dropping out of school at age 11. And what's really troubling is after she wound up dropping out of school, she wound up in a further toxic environment that her mother had created. And as she was in this toxic environment, she wound up being violated by a neighbor, Wilbur Rich, who tried to sexually violate her. And as he was attempting to sexually violate her, your Eleanor Fagan fought back. And as she fought back, this pervert and sexual deviant Wilbur Rich was arrested. Now, your officials, after arresting this man, put Eleanor in the House of the Good Shepherd under protective custody as a state witness in the case, and your Holiday was released, but the trauma and damage was done because after experiencing the lack of stability in the beginning of her life and then being sexually abused by this sexual deviant, because this was an 11-year-old child, which is just sick when you think about it. I mean, this woman was basically on the way to becoming a woman in crisis, because as she was after this whole case was cleared, and your Eleanor Fagan was released from custody in 1927 when she was 12. She was running errands for a brothel. And again, just showing how the damage of the trauma she encountered had an impact on her, because when children are abused like this, they don't know who they are, and when they get trauma like this, they try to figure things out, and that's why she was possibly running these errands in a brothel. And again, this all was laying a foundation for dysfunction, and as she was in this dysfunction, she was hearing the records of musicians like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, and that was one of the things that basically inspired her to start singing in nightclubs in Harlem. Now, when she started singing in nightclubs in Harlem, she took the pseudonym of Billie Holiday from Billie Dove, an actress she admired, and Clarence Holiday, her probable father. And she originally spelled it Haliday, but had to change it to Holiday for her performing name. And she's teamed up with different musicians, and as she's teamed up with different musicians, she began building her musical career. And as she started building her musical career, she sadly was still on the road to becoming a woman in crisis, because again, she did not have that stability in her life, and because her life was chaos, she was on the road, and traveling on the road was mostly, she was doing these nightclub jobs with very little stability and just struggling to get by. And again, this was a very miserable life. Even though she had success as a musician, she was still dealing with a lot of stress as related to her hard life, and also dealing with the stress of living in Jim Crow America, where a black woman was living a life as a second-class citizen. And while she had success, again, she worked for musicians like Count Basie and Artie Shaw, very legendary musicians, and as related to the ballroom era, but she was still dealing with a lot of stress and pressures as related to her personal life, and still dealing with a lot of issues as related to the traumas she experienced by being raised in a dysfunctional life environment. Now, in 1939, your Billie Holiday went out here and performed her iconic song, Strange Fruit. And this song, Strange Fruit, was one that was written by Abe Maripal, a Jewish school teacher, and he wrote this song to make a commentary about lynching. And your Billie Holiday was hesitant originally in the beginning to perform this song, but she performed the song because it was something that was needed to be made a commentary on, but she really didn't really want to do it because of the whole image as related to her father's death, because her father passed away because he was exposed to mustard gas in World War I, and he couldn't get medical care, and due to the racism that went on, due to the segregation in your military at the time. And as a result, sadly, your Billie Holiday's father sadly wound up passing away. But your Billie Holiday went out here and performed the song, and the lighting and everything as related to it was a powerful commentary on the racism that went on as related to the lynchings in America. And it was also a powerful commentary as related to the lynchings in America and America's indifference and hypocrisy as related to it. Now, as your Billie Holiday was out here singing the song Strange Fruit, it wound up making people in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics upset, and one of them was your Henry Anslinger, who was a racist and a white supremacist who ran that government agency from 1930 to 1968, and he gave your Billie Holiday a warning to never sing the song, and that was a violation of your Billie Holiday's constitutional rights. But this white supremacist felt like he had the right to demand that your Billie Holiday not sing this song. And because she kept singing this song, which was making a commentary on the lynchings and the anti-black racism that was going on in the country, he decided to wage his own personal war on your Billie Holiday. And he wanted to go out here and wage his personal war on Billie Holiday, and he made it a part of his so-called war on drugs, but it really wasn't a war on drugs. No, like I stated before in previous videos about your Richard Nixon and his so-called war on drugs, this was a war on a black person, and this was a war to silence the voice of a black person and take her down as related to her drug addiction, which was something that your Billie Holiday struggled with because she was still coping with the trauma as related to the sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of that sexual deviant, and she was also suffering as related to the stress that she suffered as related to living in Jim Crow America. And in order to deal with that stress, she coped with it by going out here and drinking alcohol and going out here and taking drugs. And again, as she married a man, James Monroe, in 1941, she was already a hard drinker, and she picked up her husband's habit of smoking opium, also known as heroin. And sadly, because of these addictions, their marriage didn't last. Unfortunately, Billie Holiday's addictions to your heroin wound up continuing, and she was still dealing with issues as related to this racist Henry Anslinger and his Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which went out of its way to persecute your Billie Holiday with malice aforethought. And they went out here, again, looking to try to take Billie Holiday down. And as your Billie Holiday was still struggling with these issues, she went out here and sung her other iconic legendary song, God Bless the Child. And she was with another boyfriend after her marriage failed. And this was a trumpeter known as Joe Guy. And she started with using heroin more heavily. And again, as your Billie Holiday continued to take these drugs, her life was going into a downward spiral. Even though she was very successful with her music, she was still struggling with this drug addiction, and this drug addiction was a major problem with her life. And again, eventually, this racist Anslinger eventually wound up arresting your Billie Holiday in 1947 after she went out here and appeared with her idol Louis Armstrong in the film New Orleans, playing the role of a maid. And after your Anslinger managed to get your Billie Holiday arrested and convicted for narcotics possession, she was sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison. and went out here and was released in 1948, where she was trying to go out here and reestablish her career, but it would be hard for her to do that because as a result of this federal conviction, she could not go out here and get the license to play in cabarets and nightclubs, but she could perform at concert halls and had a sold-out show at Carnegie Hall not long after her release. So your Billie Holiday continued to push back against these racists and white supremacists like this Anslinger, who was looking to destroy her, all because he didn't like what she was saying. He wanted to silence her voice. And this was some of the stress that your Billie Holiday was dealing with as related to the racism she was encountering, in addition to the entire issues she was having with drugs. And sadly, she was arrested again for drugs, but was acquitted of the charges. And this all took a toll on your Billie Holiday, over the years. It took a toll on her voice, and she tried to keep touring and recording, but sadly, she just was overwhelmed by all of this, and eventually she started to get involved with a Pookie. Now, this Pookie was known as Louis McKay, who was said to be a organized crime enforcer. And as she got involved with this Louis McKay, who was known as a Pookie, what happened was your Billie Holiday was arrested for narcotics in 1956, and your McKay basically was using Billie Holiday's name and money to advance himself. Unfortunately, Billie Holiday was still struggling with her addictions to drugs and alcohol, and her voice wasn't what it was. And because her voice wasn't what it was, she was still struggling with this, as this McKay was basically emptying out her bank account in order to enrich himself at his expense. And this is what happens to a lot of women in crisis as they're struggling with their problems. Because they radiate so much negative energy, they attract these Pookies, and these Pookies are basically parasites who go out here and leech onto a woman, and they leech onto her to get money so that they can go out here and exist. And this is no different than what happened with Halle Berry and your Gabriel Aubrey or your Oliver Martinez, or what happened as related to the actress Lana Turner and her Johnny Stompanato. What happens is that these type of parasite guys try to leech on to a struggling woman, and they suck the energy out of that woman, and up until the point where that woman is basically living in an existence where she's miserable all the time. And sadly, your Billie Holiday was miserable towards the end of her life, because after this man went out here and took all the money out of her bank account, she couldn't even trust to put money in the bank because this man would take it all out. So when she sadly passed away, she was found in her apartment, I believe, and with $700 tied to her leg and 7 cents in the bank. And that's all due to her being involved with this Pookie. And this Pookie, basically, all he wanted to do was leech off this woman. And sadly, your Billie Holiday, she was just struggling with alcohol and heroin addiction to the point where she basically sadly wound up passing away on July 17th of 1959. And she wound up passing away from cirrhosis of the liver as related to the addictions of alcohol and drugs. But the reason why she was taking all of those alcohol and drugs was because she was struggling with the trauma that she had as related to the abuse, the abandonment she had when she was a little baby, the neglect she got as related to the dysfunctional way she was raised, and the sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of this sexual deviant that her mother didn't protect her from. These were the foundations for all of the trauma that Billie Holiday went through. And sadly, because there was no mental health counseling at the time, your Billie Holiday couldn't get the help that she needed, because back in those days, during Jim Crow, a lot of black folks didn't believe in psychotherapy. They believed in Jesus and Oprah. And Oprah wasn't even born just yet, I'm sorry, but they believed in Jesus to take care of everything. But the whole thing was that she couldn't get the counseling she needed to deal with this trauma. And because she couldn't get that counseling to deal with that trauma, she wound up becoming a woman in crisis who's only got peace when she left this earth. And that's the sad part about Billie Holiday's story, was here was a girl who was born basically on the road to becoming a woman in crisis because her mother basically was in crisis because she didn't get the guidance she needed from her mother because she became a teen mom. And again, it just proves a point that I make in the woman crisis, how the dysfunction that one generation has is passed on to another, and a mother in crisis just raises one of what I call children of the corn, and sadly those children of the corn grow up like stalks, and they wind up having a life filled with dysfunction. And that's sadly what happened here to your Billie Holiday. She wound up a child of the corn, growing up like a stalk, and even though she had success, she didn't have the peace or the spiritual success that she would have under the Most High, because she didn't have a family to give her the love and stability that would allow her to flourish and thrive and be a healthy woman. And again, sadly, it was a sad story to hear about your Billie Holiday. I mean, she is a woman in crisis, and again, she grew up all through her life a woman in crisis who never really got to have the peace in life that everybody takes for granted. And that's the sad part about the whole story of your Billie Holiday. She never got to have love or peace in this world, and I'm hoping that the Most High has mercy on her and she can finally have that peace, love, and joy she never got on this earth. Now, if you want to learn why so many women like Billie Holiday go on the road to becoming women in crisis, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And if you want to see me do more stories about Hollywood historical women in crisis, you can send a donation to the PayPal, the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback and e-readers everywhere at online booksellers today.